That book came out, and then that was followed by Revisioning Psychology in 1975, which, when it came out, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. So it's Hillman is coming out of in contradistinction to Stan Grof, Hillman is coming out of a literate tradition. He studied art and culture, and he was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey, but if you look at his resume here, he spent most of his time being educated first in Trinity College Dublin and then at the University of Zurich, and then he became director of studies at the C.G. Jung Institute for 10 years, and so he has that European background in him. Now he lives out in Connecticut, so he's part of the East Coast, more literate, more artistically inclined culture, and that's sort of his cultural milieu. So that's kind of brief introduction to Hillman, and now what I would like to do is begin to move into Hillman's major ideas proper. First, I think it would be worthwhile saying a few words about what Hillman means by soul, and what he means by it can best be contrasted with spirit. Soul and spirit. We have the body, and soul is, in classical Neoplatonic thought, the link between the body and the spirit. But Hillman says, in our tradition, especially since Descartes, soul and spirit have become confused and intermixed, so that we just have this kind of Cartesian dualism now between the inner world within us and the outer world out here. But he says, as a result of that, we've kind of lost what soul is all about and how it differs from spirit. And the Greek words and the Latin words, just for comparison, Latin corpus, and soul is anima, and spirit is soma, the Greek word, pneuma is the Greek word for spirit, and the Greek word for soul is spiritus, is Latin for spirit, and then psyche. Just so we have our terms out and they're clear. Young, for example, picks up the word anima, and that becomes his personification of the male, the female part of the masculine psyche. And he says, the whole thing about soul is that soul points downward, spirit goes upward. And he contrasts the difference between the two of them using the metaphor of peaks and vales. So you have a valley and a peak. And spirit has to do with peaks, soul has to do with the vales. Because, he says, by soul, I mean a perspective on things, not a substance. I mean a viewpoint, an attitude toward things, not a thing. I don't mean to postulate the existence of the soul. I don't mean to discuss its immortality or anything like that. I simply mean cultivating an attitude toward the world and toward your life that is inward and involves a deepening. Soul has to do, it's in the valley because it has to do with pathologies, with depression, with personal idiosyncrasies, with individuality, with chaos, error, messes, mistakes. These are all enunciations of the soul. Whereas spirit has to do with purging of all of those things, of chaos, of mistakes. The spirit longs for the clean, white, bright world of the Platonic forms, the angelic world where everything is pure and perfect and eternal. And that kind of yearning for the spiritual world is not what interests Hillman at all. And so his criticism of somebody like Stanislav Grof would be precisely that there's too much of an emphasis on the spirit world, on the astral plane and so forth. There's not enough of an emphasis on living here and now and finding soul in and through the daily events of your life. So soul has to do with pathologizing, and the soul speaks and thinks in terms of images. The soul, insofar as he will say anything about it at all, is composed of images, and it understands the language of images. Spirit has more to do with concepts, and is more, soul is more feminine, spirit is more masculine, and so on. So he plays around with those things. Ken Wilber perfectly personifies the claims of the spirit. You read him and he's nothing but concepts. There is no imagery whatsoever. There is no soul, no sense of art or anything. And it's very impersonal in that sense. So this is what Hillman means by soul. It's an attitude, a way of regarding your life that has to do with having tolerance for mistakes and bringing in the fantasy life and the imagination. And so as a result of this, or consistent with it rather, Hillman's whole approach to psychology is he wants to shift its geographical locus from the north to the south. Now recall that psychoanalysis was something that was invented by Germans, by the northern, and remember in our earlier discussion about the Protestants and the Catholics, the northern world is concerned with the word, the concept, and the southern world is imagistically oriented. So what Hillman likes to do is sort of, his fantasy is of the Renaissance, with all of its wonderful images and its allegories of the soul and philosophical allegories. And he wants to take psychology out of science and out of the medical arena and shift it into something that is more consistent with the artistic world, with something that has to do with the arts. And so the shifting in the geographical locus from sort of Jung and Freud and Vienna and Zurich south to the sunny Mediterranean world is also consistent with a shift from what he calls monotheistic psychology versus polytheistic psychology. And monotheistic psychology is essentially Freud and Jung, and polytheistic psychology is his own archetypal psychology. But also, the Greeks in the Greek world and the Renaissance rediscovery of the Greek imagination had to do with this polytheistic pantheon of all these gods, whereas the North has more in common with the Hebraic imagination, with its monotheistic intolerance of polytheism and its paradigm of control over the gods, of a single heroic figure, whether we're talking about Jung's hero myth or whether we're talking about Freud's kind of metaphor of land reclamation, where he says the goal of psychoanalysis for me is where it was, there ego shall be. So it's as though the ego is slowly, like the Romans used to drain marshes and turn them into land. It's a kind of fantasy of domination and colonizing over the psyche, rather than having a tolerance for all the various gods and devils and demons and so forth. So we have a shift from the sort of Hebraic world, and Freud comes out of the Jewish background, and Jung out of the Protestant background, and remember the Protestants prefer the word to the image, as do the Hebrews, so they have that in common, versus the sunny polytheistic South. And there are a polytheism of divinities. All the gods, Heinrich Zimmer, you'll recall, had said that all the gods are within us, and Hillman would rather say that we are within all the gods. When we go to sleep at night, we have a tendency to say in psychology that you're having a dream, but in actual fact, you are within the dream. The dream has you. And so he wants to try to shift all these centers and kind of turn everything upside down, so that on the one hand, we have an expansion of the theory of archetypes. Archetypes for Hillman are in everything. Every thought, feeling, word, concept. They're not just archetypes of the collective unconscious. They are gods, and they are within everything, so that we can discover gods everywhere, and archetypes everywhere. So Hillman's theory of archetypes is actually quite different from Jung's, because with respect to the archetypes, what Hillman says is he comes in and he says the archetypes are essentially the gods, and they essentially turn out to be the Greek gods in particular. He doesn't get into Hindu mythology or any other mythological systems whatsoever other than the Greeks. And now you'll remember that Jung's theory of archetypes, and this is also Campbell's idea, includes all these geometrical archetypes, all these abstract archetypes like the world center, the archetype of the tree, the archetype of the virgin birth, the archetype of the mandala. All of those abstract archetypes are just done away with by Hillman. Anything that is not a personality, a god, is not equated with an archetype. So the archetypes turn out to be gods for Hillman, and the Greek gods in particular, because the Greek gods have shaped the Western tradition, and Hillman is very emphatic about staying with the Western tradition and not going off whoring after alien gods, as it were.
Whoring after what?
Others' gods. So then what I'd like to do now is say a couple of words about, before moving into revisioning psychology, about the book, The Myth of Analysis, and in particular the opening essay there on psychological creativity. Because Hillman asks a very important question. He says, what now is the central myth of analysis? And he says, because it's changed, it can no longer be what it was for Jung and Freud. Psychoanalysis has to change. And so he goes and he says, well, what was the central myth for Freud? That was the Oedipus myth. He says, well, what's wrong with that? The Oedipus myth doesn't take creativity into account. It's not a myth of creativity. And he says the primary task of psychology is soul making, the construction of the soul.